Hi, Luigi.
Well, I think we can start officially. Dear colleagues and friends, welcome to the first linguistic flash mob organized by a group of linguists of northern and central Italy. In these hard times due to the COVID-2 crisis, we think that social distancing can be coped with scientific proximity. And we have to keep in touch and keep exchanging ideas for scientific research to grow. This is the reason why today we have invited two very well-known linguists, Giuseppe Longobardi from the University of York and Ian Roberts from the University of Cambridge, who have both been working on the notion of parametry to exchange ideas on this topic and give us their view in the form of a contest. They will answer three questions offered by a moderator, Maria Rita Manzini from the University of Florence, and have 5 minutes each to give us their answers to each question. At the end, the moderator will summarize and comment the results, and then we open the discussion. For security reasons, the chat, microphone, and screen sharing have been disabled during the debate, but the chat will be active at the end for you to write if you intend to ask a question, and we will enable your microphone. Those of you who won't be able to ask their questions can send it to me via email. I will collect the questions and send them to the speakers for a possible later reply. The event is being streamed on YouTube. So if you ask a question, you are giving your consent to be streamed and recorded. Please feel free to distribute the link of the YouTube registration you have received with the flyer to your students, colleagues, and post it on the social media. And now I leave the floor to Rita Manzini, who will moderate the first epic battle in linguistic history.
Thank you. So, hi Ian, hi Pino. You saw three questions advertised on the leaflet. The speakers were actually sent slightly more articulated versions of these questions to sort of lead the discussion in certain directions that we were interested in. And so as an introduction to the first question, I will slightly articulate it along the lines that the speakers already had. So the first question is interactions, that is implications between parameters, which actually means between parameters values. And they were offered two examples. And the first example is interactions between value of parameter x and value of different parameters y. And so, for instance, we quoted a study by Hulke and van Kemenade, who proposed that there is incompatibility between generalized V2, that is German V2, and null subject, meaning referential null subject of the Italian kind. And so the question is, are there bona fide cases like this? Do they build a systematic pattern? What is the explanation if this is found in nature? The second articulation of the question is actually much more studied, and it has to do with implications between different values of a single parameter. Well, think of Ian's parameters hierarchies. And so I made up a fictional example, which has to do with partial pro-drop. That's Holmberg 2010 terminology. So for instance, in partial pro-drop, 1, 2p drops before 3p, that's a typical implication between different values of subject drop, referential subject drop. The questions are the same as above. Are these cases frequently attested? Are they robustly attested? What is the explanation? Note that the answers vary wildly from an implicational path along a parametric tree, a conspiracy between grammatical constraints, third factor explanations, functional optimization, or a provocation by Cecilia, a Bayesian probability procedure. So we will alternate speakers, and if you agree, in alphabetical order, I would let Pino speak first, and then Ian, and then I'll reverse the order for the next question, okay?
Yeah. Ian and I had agreed that for the first question, would speak first,
Okay.
and I would speak second.
Fine.
And
okay.
then we. Okay.
Thank you. So Ian, please.
Yeah, okay,
Thanks.
so I'll go first. Right, sorry, let me just set my little stopwatch here. Yeah, so the basic answer to the question on implicational relations among parameters that you would probably mostly expect me to give is given by something like this. I don't know, can people see that? Just say yes.
Yes.
Yes, good. So here we have an example of a parameter hierarchy of the kind that was proposed and developed in the context of the European Research Council funded advanced grant Rethinking Comparative Syntax, which I'll refer to from here on as RECOS. That was a grant which many of you know ran in Cambridge between 2011 and 2017. And what we see here are clear cases of implicational relations among parameters. And this is the kind of thing that we try to explore. So the short answer to the question, I'll now stop sharing. The short answer to the question is yes, there are implicational relations amongst parameters, and we should try as far as possible to discover them empirically. The other major pillar of the research that we tried to undertake in the context of that project was the idea that the hierarchies are created by the interaction of third factor conditions, which we initially referred to as feature economy, to be understood in the classic sense, which if anything probably goes back to sound pattern of English in the context of the evaluation metric for phonological systems, and what we called input generalization, a general principle of if a system has a feature, the feature is deployed to the maximal possible extent, constrained only by the empirical evidence. In more recent work, well, during the course of the project and subsequent to the project, Theresa Bieberauer has developed and unified those two principles under a single principle that she refers to as maximize minimal means. Still a very general third factor minimax optimization principle. So that is in a sense, the short answer. However, I think that there is an awful lot more to say about this question. I think one thing that we didn't really do, at least not as much as perhaps we could or should have done in the context of the project, was consider more precisely the nature of some of the implicational relations. We simply sort of postulated them partly on conceptual grounds, partly on empirical grounds. But I think that one can wonder about the nature of implicational relations, and there seem to be different kinds. So I'd just like to really enumerate these for discussion. Obviously, one case is a case of logical implication. So for example, a system can't have multiple WH movement without having WH movement. So it seems that there's an obvious implicational relation between the English value, let's say, of that parameter and the Slavonic value of that parameter. So that's one obvious and simple case, and in a sense, perhaps the sort of thing that we would ideally just want all our implications to look like. That certainly wasn't true in the context of the ones that we unearthed in the context of our project. Another kind of implication, which is mentioned in the question, and which is a very interesting one, is if there's some UG principle or conspiracy of principles which may lead to certain implicational relations. And an obvious case there, which also stems from work done in Cambridge and Newcastle, is the final over final condition, which basically says if you have a head final if you have the value final for the head parameter, whatever that follows from, in a given position which is not at the bottom of an extended projection, then all the heads below it in the extended projection will have to be final. So final complementizers implicate final auxiliaries, implicate final verbs, etc. That's an interesting one, which knocks out a very large number of possible disharmonic systems, and will clearly inform the way we formulate any kind of general hierarchy or parameter set to determine word order. Whatever we take as the mechanism for deriving word order variation, this is entirely neutral to any given theory of linearization. So that's the second kind of implication. A third kind of implication, which typologists have unearthed, and which has a more traditional flavor to it, perhaps, might be diachronic implications. We know that systems tend to pass through phases of different kinds. So, for example, it looks as though there's some evidence that consistent null subject languages of the Italian type develop into something like partial null subject languages, which in turn tend to develop into non-null subject languages. There's some evidence for that development across Germanic, if you go back to the very earliest stages, for example. So again, these things need to be understood. So I think what I would say is that, I don't know how much more time I have on this now. 8 seconds. Okay, so what I would say is that the answer is yes, but we need to understand and distinguish different kinds of implication. That's my egg timer.
Thank you, Ian. Pino, please.
Okay, so I think there is a background issue here, which is the question, how many parameters should we attribute to the initial state of the language? And you probably know that my proposal for the past 15 years has been basically none. In the only thing that I suppose is in the initial state of the language faculty is very abstract, very formats, which I call parameter schemata. And these are just very general question formats, like, is a feature grammaticalized in language, is a feature interpretable in a language, and there are a few of them. Now, in this framework, parameters are just questions that a learner raises and immediately solves with respect to positive X that he or she finds in the primary corpus. Now, in this sense, you can minimize the initial state of the language faculty by attributing just very little cognitive burden to it. But then the problem of implications and interactions arises, in the sense that if we gain a lot by eliminating parameters and just reducing them abstract schemata, then we must know where implications come from. Well, in principle, I see three basic cases. So there are some cases where there are logical implications which may hold among parameters which with the same feature, or even among parameter schemata more generally. Okay, and then there'll be implications between particular pairs of features. These are the kinds that typologists have noticed. I mean, since Grimberg, for instance. And then there must be some kind of output constraint to the number of possible languages generated by a parameter system. And these are principles like functional principles, Keenan's anti-semi, or the notion of affability, which was defined by Jerry Katz some 40 or 50 years ago. Okay, now, with respect to the short form, but
the audio is not perfect. Maybe you can speak close to the microphone.
I can try. Let's see.
Sometimes this is better. Sorry for the interruption.
No problem. Okay. Me better now? I'm closer. Okay?
Yes, yes,
Rita,
please.
Fine. Okay, good. So now the point is that okay, from all parameter implications, extract hierarchies which connect a few parameters which are similar, for instance, in terms of the features they affect. This is a type very often used and very usefully adopted by Ian and others, for instance. And I think that very clear and practical representations when you have to do the limited idealized domains, both languages and parameters. But when you want to do language comparison in a wider domain, then it seems that kind of representation shows some limits. Okay, first of all, there is a sort of arithmetical limit. So if you take n parameters and you try to represent them as a binary hierarchy, you should generate n plus 1 languages if n is the number of parameters. And this is a strong reduction with respect to n to 30, which should be the unimplied, the free number of languages rated by n parameters. Well, we did an experiment with a sample of real languages and proposed methods with their applications. And what came up is that out of 30 parameters, you not generate 31 languages, and you don't even generate 2 to 30 languages, something around 2 to 17 languages, which is quite between. But this shows that just hierarchies can be very legitimate idealizations, but they are very insufficient to systematically describe big chunks of languages and parameters. And in this sense, what we must say is main implications are complex. So, for instance, one parameter in the real world can be affected by the values of up to 5 or 6 other parameters. And these implications contain both disjunctions and conjunctions. And most importantly, even if you extract interesting hierarchies from a system of parameters and implications, many of the implications are horizontal, in that they cross, they go across hierarchies. So, for this reason, in the ERC project that I ran for the past years in York, the so-called engineering project, what we did was I tried to show. Let me see, to show you my screen, if possible. Just okay. See my screen now? Sorry. Can you see my screen?
No, we cannot.
No.
Oh. Okay.
You have 1 minute. 2.
Okay. See that now? Rita?
No, we cannot. I don't know whether it's your connection that is too slow.
Well, okay. Anyway, it's a table of parameters. Can you see it now?
No.
Okay. So why can't you? Let me see.
I suggest we move along, and maybe you send sorry, your slide to the Padua people whilst I summarize and do other useless stuff, so that maybe you can show it later.
Yes, fine. Okay. So anyway, point is this. So we adopted a different format of representation, which basically collapses implications for a number of parameters and lays them down in a general table. And now I think that the real challenge is how to generate a table of this type from all hierarchy equations that you can represent in EN system, or even vice versa, only using natural constraints, so constraints that you should not attribute to the initial state of the mind, which then do not too much cognitive weight on the initial state of the language faculty. I think this is the real point. Okay, so how you can connect a number of hierarchies and a representation of all these hierarchies with cross-hierarchy implications.
Thank you.
Okay.
So the format is meant to move quickly.
Yes.
So the second question was another classical question about parameters and learnability. Here my articulation goes quicker. We took a key question of learnability to be the triggering questions. It is the evidence necessary and sufficient to set the parameter, and the specific examples that we gave here was the perhaps the first hypothesis that was put forward in this field, the classical degree zero learnability of likelihood. That is the hypothesis that everything can be learned from simple and embedded domains. And so in this perspective, which I suggested in my formulation of the question, might be updated in a number of ways. For instance, we may think of phasal domains, which are, as we know, crucially involved in externalization. And so the question that arises is, do computational and or functional principles, the so-called third factor principles of Chomsky, contribute, and in which way, to learnability? How do you see the issue of learnability in this perspective? A different question is the question that I might call the Hayam's 1983 question. That is there a correspondence between parametric values and the predicted sequence of acquisition? And the reason why this is relevant in a learnability context is because it in fact raises the issue of parametric defaults, an old issue, but one that has never quite gone away. And so the question is learnability or acquisition, if you prefer, and the internal articulation of the question is the one that I just sketched, both for our listeners and for you. And so do I understand that you go first, Pino, on this question? Okay.
Yes. Okay, so I think it's a bit mature to actually provide an answer to such specific questions. And I will try to sketch some background considerations which lead me to this conclusion. Okay, so I think that learnability of diversity, namely of parameters, is really the crucial issue to attain explanatory adequacy. Attaining explanatory adequacy is a way to take the very problem for which geometric grammar was proposed originally as a cognitive, namely the logical problem of language addition. And my impression is that somewhat neglected recently, so that the real questions such as the ones that you raised are actually a bit premature and speculative for now. And I would like to suggest one reason we are behind in this, namely that there is a difference between, say, phonology and syntax, because unlike phonology, syntax has data about variation. Okay, even if we have the that we've been studying a lot of languages and a lot of diversity, actually we don't have much evidence to really build up systematic theory. And especially we don't have evidence about the diversity which is already cast in good parametric terms. So in formats like the ones of hierarchies or ones of table that I tried to show before. And in a sense, the other problem is that although differences among languages have been reduced to parametric terms, there are still too few languages which being compared systematically with respect to one the same parameter. This is a very, very serious problem, actually. And this makes a big difference, for instance, with a domain with which I've come in contact for reasons connected to my project, namely with biology, where, for instance, DNA comparison is much more advanced in terms of data, not of theory, but certainly there. And it's just a question of subject matter, of resources and so on. In a sense, it's a question of role models. In the sense that students of linguistics, for instance, do not have data mining and data miniaturization for trying to build up theories for the data. Okay, this is a difference between what they do in population biology and what we do in linguistics. Okay, so these are background problems to try to address problems in learnability and acquisition, and problems in, I would say, with explanatory, which still remain. But I want also to make a suggestion. For and along explanatory adequacy, there are other neglected ways to test the cognitive realism of parameter models. For instance, we could pursue what I call the oldest problem of modern linguistics, namely how variation distributes in time and space. In a sense, this means shifting the focus from just acquisition to the acquisition by an idealized speaker to basically historical development in language transmission, and ultimately to language phylogenies based parametric diversity. And when you try to do that, in particular, you see how selective hierarchies, which I said are a very good and legitimate idealization, are insufficient in order to pursue these goals. What you need is some more data-oriented collection of parameters into big tables, a little bit along the lines of the one that I want to show before. Okay.
I think it's Ian's turn, please.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Well, my answer will sort of center on a particular assumption about the nature of parameters, which is fairly widely held in the field, I think, and that's what Baker called the Borer-Chomsky conjecture. That is the idea that parametric variation reduces to properties of formal features of functional heads. So then the key issue becomes, how do children detect the presence or absence of those formal features? A further view we can take is that if something like feature economy, or a subcase of maximize minimal means, is an operative third factor condition in language acquisition, then actually children don't need to detect the absence of features. They assume, as it were, the absence of features. They only have to detect the presence of features. This links in with something that we kind of know, but don't fully understand, about correlations among properties connected to parameters, and that is that aspects of inflectional morphology do seem to form crucial triggers for certain parameters. And actually, again, this is something that one can sometimes see particularly clearly in the diachronic domain, where the loss of a given part of an inflectional morphology in a language can give rise to the loss of a certain syntactic property. Perhaps the best known case of that is the loss of V to I movement, or V to T movement, in early modern English, correlating with the loss of most of the agreement inflection in the language, in particular plural agreement marking on verbs. So we don't fully understand the nature of these correlations, but they do really seem to hold. Similarly, some notion of rich, in fact, richer agreement correlating with null subjects of the Romance type, possibly the absence of agreement correlating with null arguments of the East Asian type, and so on. So this kind of thing does seem to be there. The other thing that we know from the acquisition literature, I speak as a non-expert, is that children are very sensitive to inflections and are mostly very good at learning inflectional morphology. So all these observations seem to sort of cohere around a picture which suggests that aspects of inflectional morphology play a very key role in parameter setting, but they can't be the only thing. There clearly have to be other things as well. And here, actually, I'd like to pick up on one aspect of Lightfoot's old proposal. The proposal was originally made, there was a monograph, which I guess most people know from '91, but the proposal was originally made in an article, in a target article in the journal Behavioral and Brain Sciences.
Yeah, I know.
And one of the respondents to that was Luigi Rizzi, who made the suggestion that perhaps the relevant domain is narrower than Lightfoot's concept of degree zero, but in fact the government domain of a head, as formulated as it would have been in 1989, which of course we can rethink in various ways. Again, the technicalities aren't really important, but notice that this again coheres very well with the Barrère-Chomsky conjecture. If we think that the properties of the formal features of a head will be particularly visible in the local domain of that head, however exactly we define that notion of local domain. So I think that line of work coheres with various things we know typologically from acquisition and from language change to point in a clear direction, although, as I say, our understanding of this is very patchy. And I think it's probably patchy partly for the kinds of reasons that Pino was articulating. Another thing one could say in answer to this question is, again, taking our cue from Hyams's early work, would be to say, well, let's look at what children say. Let's look at child production and just see what happens. And we know that there are very interesting things, but there's a major confound there, as pointed out by Ken Wexler, in what he called very early parameter setting. And it seems very clear that a lot of the really interesting parameter setting happens before kids actually say anything. In particular, the evidence for the head parameter, head directionality, as I understand it, again, speaking as a non-expert on language acquisition, as I understand it, this is the basic word order properties are fixed before children say anything. So Japanese children never produce head initial phrases, and English children never produce head final ones, etc. The other thing I would say is that, going back to the RECOS project, the kinds of hierarchies that we were proposing, I had the slide earlier, are also, well, at least one take on this, which I would personally want to pursue because it's just a very strong hypothesis, is that the hierarchies also define learning paths. So if the first option for null arguments is time up?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay.
I was actually saying yes.
Oh, actually, according to my phone, my time is up.
It's up. So in the interest maybe of keeping these fast and having questions, let's move to the final question. I will also be very short. And the final question is actually one which is logically prior to this one. That is to the questions that we asked you to answer. And that is the question whether there is in fact a primitive called a parameter and there is in fact a parameters theory, or whether Chomsky and Berwick and Chomsky are right in proposing that, and other people have had that idea before them, but they sort of encapsulated it nicely. If they are right in assuming that essentially, as I put it, parameters are the elsewhere of G. That is, where UG doesn't care, and specifically at the externalization interface. And here comes the Barrère-Chomsky hypothesis, lexical parameterization. And here comes linearization at the interface. This is where UG doesn't care. There is where parameters live. And so I would like to hear what you have to say on this last question, which is, of course, logically prior and allows you to wrap up nicely what you've been saying before. So you go first, Pino, or Ian? Which?
Ian, I guess.
Yes,
I
think,
okay, fine.
Yeah. Okay, I'll go first. Yeah, well, again, the view that we tried to articulate and develop in the context of the RECOS project was to take the idea that parameters actually result from the interaction of the three factors of language design. So the contribution of UG to that, the first factor, is that UG doesn't mind. Parameters consist of underspecified formal features of functional heads. So that's the thing which is left open and that has to be specified in order to get the system to work, as it were. And which set of formal features or which subset of formal features is underspecified is a question that is very difficult to answer, in part because we don't really know what the set of formal features is. To my knowledge, we don't even have a good extensional definition of formal features, never mind an intentional one. So it's difficult to define a subset of a set whose nature is not really known. But of course, a working hypothesis would be all of them. So UG leaves the values of all features, all formal features open. That's a strong hypothesis, and it's an interesting one that one should maybe make initially and then retreat from. That brings me to Chomsky, the Berwick-Chomsky proposal about externalization. I think it's right in part. I certainly would agree that linearization is an aspect of externalization. I think probably many people would nowadays. And many other things could be too. And notice that if parameters are connected to inflectional morphology, which, by the way, would constitute the trigger and the second factor contributing towards the nature of parameters, then clearly, again, externalization, or the PF wing of the grammar, is crucially important. But I'm not convinced that all parameters reduce to externalization in this sense. Neither am I convinced. In fact, neither do I really find myself in agreement with what seems to be a kind of subtext in Chomsky and Berwick's proposal, which is that the parameters are kind of add-ons and not really very important for really understanding the true nature of the system of universal grammar, or the language faculty. I suspect that that's too strong a position, and I think that we're all here talking about parameters, so it shows that we don't, for the most part, think that there's something to be sort of, as it were, secondary to the true heart of the system. And furthermore, I think that one could imagine that under specification, in the way that I described it as the first factor contribution to parameterization, is in fact intrinsic to the way the system works. And so therefore one would not expect it to be confined to simply one interface. That's a view which I'm inclined to take if you like, in opposition to the Berwick and Chomsky position. So to sum up, the view that I would still want to take regarding the nature of parameters, and indeed parameter hierarchies, is that they result from, they are emergent properties resulting from the interaction of the first factor under specified UG, the second factor, the way the child interacts with trigger experience, and this links to what I was saying earlier about inflectional morphology, and the third factors, which are things such as feature economy and input generalization. Another thing, by the way, which I should have mentioned really in answer to the second question, but if I've got time, I'll just throw it in now, as a third factor, which I personally think may prove to be extremely important, is Yang's proposals regarding the tolerance principle. I think that this is something that we should be paying very careful attention to. I think I'll stop there. I don't know if I've used it.
Yeah. So we have time for questions. So please, Pino.
Yeah. Okay. So as Ian stressed, I think there are actually two questions there. One question is if there are structure and constraints in faculty of language beyond few strictly universal principles. Okay. And my answer to this question is definitely yes, in the sense what is something in addition to just merger or maybe some other localities, some locality principles or some other small universal principles within the borders of Babel. The borders of Babel must include at least what I call parameter schemata, and probably a theory of features and their implications, a little bit like a general theory, a universal theory of phonological features or phonetic features is available in phonology. Okay, and then one important point to make is that this structure, which regard as contained within the board Babel, actually produce somewhat intricate and deductively interesting domains of linguistics in general. I mean, it's not something that we can just leave out as externalized and then depending on something which has little with language. The second question is whether parametric variation only affects externalization, and if by externalization I mean basically words, in the linearization, spell out properties. Well, my simple preliminary answer would be yes. At least this is my empirical experience, in the sense that if we take what they call parameter schema, some of those which are most represented in a large set of parameters across languages are schemata like is there overt or covert? Is a certain functional category overt or logically null? When a certain category is moved, extracted, or does it trigger piping of larger constituents? So all of these processes seem to be very easily connected to externalization. Another type of consideration, again, once again, for this conclusion, is connected to diachronic evidence. This notion of connection between sync and diachrony, between theory and diachrony, seems to come out repeatedly in this debate with Ian, and I think we fully on that. And that's related to Keenan of inertia theory. Basically, translated in current technical terms, Keenan's inertia theory claims that syntax in diachrony does not experience primitive change. It only reacts to changes in more external domains, mainly in the lexicon and what we would call the sensory motor interface. Okay, and okay, this is okay. If this is the case, of course, variation would be mainly produced in the most externalized domains, language. Now the question is whether Keenan's inertia theory is true, and if it can be tested empirically. Well, I think that there is some evidence that this theory may be correct. Some evidence may precisely come from experiments doing phylogenetic analysis of languages through parameters. Because the fact that phylogenetic analysis of parameters seems to work and to reveal language relationships at a very long time depth suggests that syntax is possibly very conservative and even more conservative than the lexicon itself. If this is the case, something must be correct in Keenan's inertia theory. Keenan's inertia theory really points toward creation as originating in the most external parts of it. That's it.
Thank you. Right now, I'm supposed to summarize the main points of this discussion. Of course, I'm playing, I should say, without a safety net. That is, I didn't know what the speakers were going to say. Because we are short on time, I will be very, very fast in my review. So it seems to me that the answers to questions 1 and 3 integrate one another. And it seems to me it emerges clearly from what Ian has been saying, that in the results of his project, in his work, parameters are an emergent property. There is definitely no parameter switches or anything of the sort within UG, within the borders of Devon, to use the terminology of Pino. And all sorts of things could be going on to organize the parameter space. So for Ian, the parameter space is organized, for instance, by his parameters hierarchies. And there may be logical implications that organize this parameter space. There may be UG principles, conspiracies of principles that organize the space, but there is no primitive theory of parameters, so to speak. Or there is a descriptive field of parameters theory, but and there are an attempt at deriving salient properties theoretically, but it seems to me, and maybe I understood incorrectly, but then we'll clarify that within the questions period, that for Pino, on the contrary, there is at least that part that he calls parameter schemata that is somehow embedded within UG. It is within perhaps not the faculty of language in the narrow sense, but it is somehow a given. Parameter schemata cannot be done away with. And so this provides the answer both to the issue that I posed first, and that is the answer to the first question somehow flows from these different views that the two speakers have of the parametric space. In the answer to question 2, Pino emphasized something which we all agree with. It's of course very important. It is enriching our empirical base. And noted even there, I would like to point out, it's not obvious in which direction to go. So some people go in the direction of trying to enrich our knowledge of typological parameters. Others go in the direction of trying to deepen our knowledge of so-called microparameters. And I think all directions are welcome and all directions are necessary to converge to a rich enough database so that we can settle questions. Because, you know, we are looking for data not because we are philologists in the sense of Cedric Burks, but because masses of data, you know, biology docet, eventually will help us restrict the field of possible theoretical solutions. And I, on the other hand, Ian answered more directly my questions. He mentioned importantly the issue of inflectional morphology as a potential trigger, a local trigger, in the sense of Lightfoot, in the sense of Rizzi, in the sense of many people sharing some intuition about the local, the possibility of setting parameters locally. And finally, yes, let's take note of the caveat of Ian on the subtext of the Berwick and Chomsky proposal. I wasn't really reading the subtext into it. I was just, you know, sort of treating it straightforwardly. I don't think I like the subtext either, but, you know, many of us discussing parameters probably don't. So at this point, I think Cecilia should be ready with questions and questioners.
Well, actually, I don't have questions on the email address, and now the chat is active. So
Okay.
I would like to ask you, so if you have questions, just write your name on the chat and we will enable you.
Shall I ask a question, Cecilia, in the meantime?
Yes, just please do.
So, Ian, in fact, there is a structuring. So there are principles enabling us to structure the parametric space within a single parameter. So, for instance, realization, non-realization of empty categories, of nominal empty categories. But there's really no way of organizing the space between parameters. So between word order and null subjects or stuff like that. I think Pino said something which I didn't catch completely because I had some problem of audio, right? But as far as Ian's answer was concerned, that is not really there. I mean, I'm not asking it antagonistically, just asking.
Well, so would I be right in saying that your question is really about implicational relations between parameter hierarchies rather than within a hierarchy?
Right, in your terms, yes.
Yeah, well,
or values, or say, point, you know, people who believe that there is a possible relation between word order and saying null subjects, right? Those people believe that you can actually have implication. I don't think so, but just to make it clear, right, that you can take a point in a particular hierarchy and a point in another, and there is an implication between those. That's classically, that's what people might think.
Yeah, we wouldn't want to exclude that, but the nature of the implication would have to be guaranteed by something else. So it is conceivable that fixing a parameter somewhere in one hierarchy and then fixing a completely independent, in principle, completely independent parameter somewhere in some other hierarchy would give rise to a system that couldn't work for some reason. We certainly wouldn't want to exclude that. I think the specific example of verb seconds and null subjects is probably not a good one, actually. The evidence from medieval Romance languages is that they were verb second and they did have null subjects.
Yeah. So, that was Pino, do you want to add something? Cecilia, I'm not seeing anything in the chat.
Luigi has a question, so
Okay.
as soon as Pino answers, then Luigi can
Okay.
ask his question.
Okay,
Do you want to add something? Otherwise, we can just go to Luigi.
Okay, then I want to add something. So going back to the issue of hierarchies and in the context of a huge number of parameters, one thing that you see is that many possible hierarchies are short, in the sense that in the actual world, I mean, you have implications between 2 or 3 parameters. But there are a lot of implications across these hierarchies, ones which are very small. So this phenomenon is a really robust one when you look at a robust number of languages, at a robust number of parameters. And as I said, I consider this as the main challenge, trying to reduce these inter-hierarchy interactions and implications to something which can be justified from outside an overspecified UG. So reducing them to general principles that we can accept without enlarging the size of UG and on the cognitive structure of the initial state. This probably recapitulates the part that you said.
Luigi?
Yes, okay. I wanted to make a comment that somehow relates to both presentations. It seems to me that it may be too weak to claim that parameters are a domain characterized negatively by universal grammar. That is to say, a domain about which universal grammar does not care. And this is because if we take some version of the Chomsky-Borer conjecture, and I think it's inevitable, in some form it is inevitable to see formal features in the lexicon as the locus of parameters, right? I don't see any real alternative to that. If we make that assumption, then there is a well-identified locus for a parameter within UG, which is the set of formal features. So clearly UG must say something, and probably UG may almost reduce to that, must say something about the set of formal features. A rather elementary empirical observation is that of all the properties that are cognitively salient or perceptually salient, only a very small subset is actually grammaticalized, right? So there is a choice of the set of properties that we may think of, which language is grammaticalized. The argument was made very clearly by Guglielmo Cinque, but I think there are several people actually discussed that, right? So there is a set of features that have been selected for grammaticalization, and these are the features on which parameterization takes place. So just to give you an example, something like physical shape can be grammaticalized as many systems of categories, nominal categories, may refer to shape, but no language, to the best of our knowledge, may refer to color. So there's nothing like agreement for yellow objects, right? So these are very simple examples, but there are many, many examples of this sort that suggest that there is a choice of features which may be grammaticalized. So that's the domain of parameterization, essentially. So it's within this set of features that parameters can be expressed. And this is something that must be specified by universal grammar, as far as I can tell. I don't see any obvious way to avoid that conclusion. And so it's important, I think, not to look parameters as something that is completely external to universal grammar. I mean, a crucial empirical question is what are the features? What are the features on which we operate and which can vary across languages? Clearly, it's not anything imaginable. The theory must be more restrictive than that. And I think you both mentioned something that goes to some extent on this direction, but maybe you don't agree with the particular way in which I phrased this. Okay, so I'll stop here.
May I say something, Rita?
Yeah, Pino, please, and
Okay,
then
no.
Ian.
Yes, no, in reply to Luigi. Yeah, I fully agree. And this is what I meant when I said, well, you must have an inventory of features analogous to one which exists in phonology, in a sense. So even with hierarchies among them, there is a problem, an additional problem which can be raised. And maybe there is no clear answer to this problem. Namely, what is the minimal number and what is the maximal number of features to be grammaticalized? Notice that there may be a sort of vague answer. If you take phonology, so minimal number was maximal number of vowels that a language may use as phonemes. Okay, and there probably the answer is that, well, probably the minimum is at least 2, but this is not completely clear. There are construction of Indo-European which almost claim that there was just one vowel. And on the other side, we know that no language has 100 vocalic phonemes, but we are not able to place an actual maximum. So it's possible that something analogous takes place in the case of grammatization of features and of syntactic features.
Ian, do you want to?
Yeah, maybe I should perhaps just clarify. I don't think that there's a big disagreement between at least one version of the position I was articulating and what Luigi was saying, and in fact, for that matter, what Pino's just said. Basically implicit in what I was saying when I said UG doesn't mind, so that's the contribution of the first factor, is that there would be a set of, well, the simplest way to look at it would be to say there is a set of features which is made available by UG, but there's no constraint on what the selection amongst that set of features is, in principle, okay, as far as UG is concerned. So whatever constraint you observe comes from the second or the third factors. That would be the idea. Now, a slightly more radical, actually a significantly more radical version of this position is one that Teresa Wieberauer has been working out both during the course of the RECOS project and in subsequent work, namely that in fact the nature of the formal features is also an emergent property. So it is not determined directly by UG, but by the interaction of the second and third factors. Then one comes up against the kind of empirical issue that Luigi was alluding to. That is, why don't we see color agreement or so forth? I mean, that then becomes a major issue. But notice that if we simply say UG doesn't make reference to color features, we could still ask the deeper question, well, why doesn't it? So the question arises really on either view. And I don't have an answer to that question.
Thank you. We have at least 3 questions. So since I would first, Alessandra Tomaselli. Alessandra, can you switch on?
So I have, first of all, a very general observation which relates to the third question. So if we assume that there is no theory of parameters, so parameters are not relevant to define UG and the faculty of language, we are saying that language variation, so language diversity, is not a defining property of language. I mean, it's the same to say that, okay, there are different languages, there is language variation, it doesn't matter, it's not a relevant aspect to define the language faculty. So, and I think we cannot take this assumption very simply. I don't know where, but language diversity is a peculiar aspect of the language acquisition device. Very simply, maybe we have not developed a theory of parameter yet, but there is space to elaborate it. Otherwise, we are not, from my point of view, it's very difficult to assume a theory of language that cannot take into consideration one of the most visible aspect of the language nature. This is an observation, maybe too banal, but I had to express it. The other one relates to the first question. So the correlation between verb second and prodrop, of course, is not a simple one. The real question is which kind of verb second is not compatible with which kind of prodrop. And I think that Afke, Hulke, Hans van Kemenade were on the right track when they said that in a specific kind of verb second, due to a feature of comp or not due to information structure, you cannot find a referential prodrop because tense or inflection cannot be rich enough or rich at the same time as comp. Maybe that this has to do with economy. If you have a feature characterization of C, which is the same, which is required by tense in order to license referential pro, the two possibilities are not given in the same language.
Thank you.
Did I express myself properly?
Yeah, very clear. Ian, do you want to answer? V2 is your stuff.
Yeah, well, concerning the second point, I think actually the issue is not really medieval Romance in general, but specifically Old French, and maybe a couple of languages which behave very similarly to Old French. But I think maybe we could have a discussion about the intricacies of Old French some other time. Concerning the more general point, no, we clearly do want to have a theory of the nature of variation. In fact, that was really behind my slight misgiving about the subtext of the Chomsky-Berwick thesis, because it seems to me that if you simply sort of siphon off variation into the PF wing of the grammar and say that's not really the core of the system, then you are kind of opening up the door to not really bothering to have a theory of variation. But I think we're all here because we're interested in the theory of variation, and I've tried to articulate one in which the notion of parameter is not a primitive, quite simply, but something that follows from the interaction of other things. So that's basically the position.
Yeah, I think your position is clear. Ian, sorry, Pino. Pino, do you want to answer?
Yes, I think we all agree with what Alessandra said, especially on the first point, and I think that Ian and I made that sufficiently clear. Now, there's just one point I would like to specify, that the fact that UG and in general the fact of language has to do with variation is somehow an empirical point. I mean, it's not an analytic conclusion. So in principle, it would be perfectly possible for the faculty of language or faculty concerning any other cognitive domain, which places some universal constraints and leaves a completely unstructured elsewhere domain. The empirical point is that we claim that this is not the case for language and for syntax in particular.
Thank you. I would like Pierre
is, yes.
Pierre Larivé.
Yes.
From Frankfurt, is that right? No. Go ahead.
Thank you. Apparently, in some cases, speakers can reset parameters, to use old terminology, within their lifetime. So you can have English children who use null subjects in their early life and then move on to something else. Assuming this is the case, even if, what happens to parameter resetting? How does that work in your respective views?
Yeah, Pino maybe, or Ian?
Ian, do you want to go?
I think I can say something about that. If you're alluding to something, to the, sort of the original interpretation of Nina Hyams's work, which was actually Nina Hyams's interpretation at the time, that, in a sense, children acquiring English pass through what we could put simplistically as an Italian type phase. That seems, I think the consensus among people working in language acquisition now is that that is not the right interpretation of what the children do. And in fact, it looks as though the early null subject phenomenon, and again, I say this with some trepidation as a non-expert, but it looks as though the early null subject phenomenon doesn't really correspond to a value of the null subject parameter that we find in any adult system which has null subjects, be it the Italian type or the Chinese type or what have you. So it seems more likely that what's going on here is some aspect of the maturing grammar. Now, I don't want to imply by that that there's a genetically encoded program for maturation, although of course that has been suggested by Wexler, actually by Luigi and by others. Rather that this is essentially the process of parameter fixation, which might be characteristic of systems where the primary linguistic data is in certain respects obscure. This seems to be what's happening with root infinitives, which is not quite the same thing as early null subjects, which seem to be characteristic of non-null subject languages with poor agreement paradigms, English, of course, being a very good case in point. And here again, I think that the place to look for answers to look for a new understanding of what's going on is actually in Yang's tolerance principle, which I think can be very interestingly applied in this area.
I have various questions, but I have a brief comment from Hagit, who has been evoked a lot. So if Hagit is online, please.
Yes, I'm online. I'm visible even. Okay. Actually, I want to take as my starting point the point that Pino made about phonology and how many vowels there may or may not be in a given language. And I can tell you as a person who lives in the UK that there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of vowels in English. And all you have to do is compare how, let's say, Ian speaks to how Peter speaks, and that gives you just a very partial sample of all the vowels around. Now, the key, of course, in which you, in fact, did insert into your discussion, Pino, is that we don't talk about vowels, we talk about phonemes. And the description of what phonemes are is distributional. And if we look at parameters or contingencies between parameters as distributions, then in some sense you might say that the disappearance of V2 in English and the disappearance of case marking becomes a phoneme. But our grammars are not structured to actually make that kind of statement. So in some sense, we are not even descriptively speaking at the point where we can state that kind of contingency, assuming it to hold. We are not in a position to actually state it in any way that derives from our own theory. Not to mention the fact that we don't really have a consensual understanding of what the formal features are of functional heads. When I was coming up with whatever it is that later became the Boyer-Chomsky conjecture, I was dealing with very few structures. It was mostly case, maybe a little bit of the inflectional system auxiliaries, except for case markers and stuff like that. I mean, it's not, once it became the kind of feature industry that it is at present, I think that's just my take on the so-called Boyer-Chomsky conjecture, that at present it means very little, unfortunately, Okay.
Okay, so Pino, do you want to add something? Thank you.
Just that when I was talking about vowels, I actually used the term vocaphonemes in the sense that it's the number of vocalic phonemes which must be lead in some sense that we understand in phonology. Of course, then all the realizations and all the relations within something we may even call the linguistic community be much larger. And probably this is a point where the parallelism between phonology and syntax and parameters breaks down a little bit. In the sense there is a lot of phonetic variation, of harmonic variation. It's not clear that the same amount of alloparameterization is actually present in active communities. This is probably a real difference. I don't know if you guys hear about that.
Okay, so the next person in line is Eric Groth.
Yeah, I can't use the chat, Cecilia. Yes, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. I sort of wanted to follow up on Luigi's question or observation. Actually, I think connects with everything here, is that there's the the absolute relevance, I think, of all parametric variation to UG itself, in a sense, if we only see the phonetic surface, I think it's a very strong argument that Luigi made, that basically we are talking about UG here and not simply about questions of externalization. But I wonder too that this is assuming, in a sense, the basic minimalist idea that there is flexibility, at least on the side of phonology. We know that. So on the sensory motor side of things, we know there's variation. We simply know that empirically. And the idea that there would be any variation on the conceptual intentional side is kind of just beyond imagining, right? That would complicate things too much. So there's this notion that that side of the interface is absolutely fixed. And I wonder whether there's any difference between the two approaches that we're talking about here today concerning whether there is variation, in a sense, on the semantic side as well, because it's kind of a theoretical simplification to say that on the conceptual interface side, there is no real variation available. I mean, we know some things seem to be fixed. I mean, for example, as Luigi pointed out, there are no color semantics seems to enter into grammaticalization. But it's not absolutely clear to me that there can't be variation on that side. And I kind of wonder whether these two ways of thinking about parameterization might actually shed some light on that question, or whether it's just simply too complicated and we have to continue to assume an absolutely flat semantics across all human cognition.
Please, speakers, who wants to take this one?
I can. Pino, do you want to say something, or
but go ahead.
Yeah, actually, I have a suspicion we might both say the same thing here. The simplest interpretation of the Borer-Chomsky conjecture would be that the parameters simply don't affect the conceptual intentional interface. And I think that I would want to stick by that interpretation unless there was some really clear evidence to the contrary. And actually this, I should, as an aside, following on from Hagit's point just now that the Borer-Chomsky conjecture doesn't tell us much, unfortunately that is true because we have such a non-theory of the nature of formal features. But if we take formal features to be formal features, that is that they have an interaction with syntax and with the PF interface. But when you get to the LF interface, the CI interface, following essentially the thrust of Chomsky's proposals for many years now, all the uninterpretable features have been eliminated. So you just have a set of interpretable features. Then you're probably not going to see very much variation. Of course, the more you take the view that everything is optional, the more the likelihood of variation, the more the possibility of variation would hold. But here questions of effability and so forth come up. I think actually there is one proposal out there that I'm aware of for what one would construe as a semantic parameter, or a parameter that primarily affects the CI interface, and which it's not, probably one can reduce it to formal features, and that's Kierkegaard's nominal mapping parameter. But on that, since it has to do with the mapping of denotations of nominals, I'll hand over to Pino.
Pino, do you want to say something?
Yes. Well, of course. I mean, I part in this debate about nominal mapping and semantic parameters, and I think that in subsequent work, I've tried to argue that actually the parameterization which has been tentatively dealt with in terms of semantic parameters can be dealt with in terms of grammarization of features, namely in terms of whether the notion of person in languages is used as a formal feature which may trigger organization of certain categories and even trigger movement to certain categories, as opposed to languages where person is used basically as a semantic concept without grammaticalization. Well, then the question is grammaticalization of a certain feature, which obviously may have a semantic content, is that a semantic parameter, or is just actually grammaticalization, a feature from the possible inventory? Well, I think we are actually entitled to call that a semantic parameter in the sense that we make hypotheses about a difference in the conceptual intentional representations in the minds of speakers of different languages. So I claim, for instance, that in Japanese, the person is not grammaticalized. I think we can all agree about that. And they also claim that a lot of consequences, the structure of phrases in Japanese as opposed to Indo-European languages. But of course, we don't think that the conceptual system of Japanese people is different from ours.
Thank you. And I think Cecilia has a question from, or perhaps more than one question from the web.
Exactly. I got a question from Omer Preminger, who is following us on YouTube, and I'm reading out his message. He says, I am struck by how much of the discussion seems to be captive to implicit, but seemingly deeply held lexicalist assumptions. The phonological material is late inserted, and more importantly, the morphological exponent does not necessarily align with the syntactic terminal in the general case, then the claim that changes in so-called externalization are a driving force that then drives a change in the syntactic component or in the lexicon narrowly construed. It has the set of available syntactic atoms, is far, far from innocent. For example, changes in inflectional morphology can be readily handled as changes in spell-out rule, for instance, presence or absence of impoverishment rules. Why would such changes have any repercussions for narrow syntax unless there was a fundamental propensity for change in the narrow syntax in the first place, in contrast to the externalization-driven views? Thanks, Omer.
Okay, any lexicalist here who wants to answer?
I don't normally admit to being a lexicalist in public, but anyway, I don't think actually, I think the issue here, coming back to the three factors, Omar's absolutely correct that if you say that a rich inflectional system is entirely a matter of what's going on in PF and that the syntax in some sense can't see it, then I mean, these are just entirely separate aspects of the computational system, then the whole question of how and why we might see an interaction between so-called rich agreement and variation, synchronic or diachronic, really becomes very acute. And Jonathan Boblik has made the same point, and I think Omar's absolutely right. But I think here what has to be key is the role of the second factor. That is the way that the child interprets surface inflectional morphology as instantiating aspects of the abstract syntactic system. And that's where we have to make hypotheses. And it's difficult, it becomes very tricky. As I said, when I was talking about this, our understanding of these things is patchy, but the empirical side of it looks to me pretty clear. We see these correlations synchronically and diachronically, so we have to somehow account for them.
Pino, do you want to add something?
Well, the only thing I can add is that there is a kind of work will be done and should be done in that direction, namely trying to put together a number of pieces of evidence which are necessary and sufficient to set parameter, and then trying to apply this set and to revise this set in different languages, across different languages. I think this is the only direction we may proceed. Namely, we must take one or two parameters in trying to lay down all the possibilities of these parameters that we see in different languages, and then restrict them to those which can be possibly taken to be the triggers for parameter setting and even for parameter resetting in other circumstances. And this is the only methodological way in which I think we can gain some insights about the problems which have been raised.
So thank you to the speakers, and thank you to all of the friends who intervened and who listened to us. And I think the final word is to Cecilia.
Yes, I also thank you all for having been here today. And we wanted to announce the next linguistic flash mob. So the next epic battle in history will be next week. It's not that we are planning to have one every week, don't worry. But the next one will be next week. And the two discussants will be Guglielmo Cinque from University of Venice and Peter Svenonius from University of Tromsø. On the topic functional hierarchies, you will also get, so the moderator will be Alessandra Tomaselli from the University of Verona, and you will get the flyer through the usual channel, so through email. And well, at the end of this meeting, I would like to thank all the people who have participated into the event. Emma, can you give me the... Okay, so our graphic artist is Enrico Castro. Our music director, you heard the jingle at the beginning, is Atte Matshuben. Our security guys are Tommaso Balsemis, Tommaso Battiuzzi, Francesco Penzin, Giacomo Presotto, and Yang Yusun. And the organizing committee, which has been supporting and organizing the whole, is a group of only female linguists coming from northern and central Italy. Chiara Gianollo, Alessandra Giorgi, Cristina Guardiano, Maria Teresa Guasti, Maria Rita Manzini, Elena Pagliarini, myself, Emanuela Sanfelice, and Alessandra Tomasello. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I hope I'll see you next week. Bye.
Thank you very much, Cecilia and Rita.
Thank you.
Thank you, people.
Bye.
Okay, thanks to the organizers and then to of course.
See you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.